Okay, next up, we'll be hearing from Jon Alexander and Design Council trustee Tendai Chetse. As you'll see from their on-screen chemistry, they know each other well, and we'll be discussing how we move from designing for consumers to designing for citizens in our response to climate change. Jon Alexander is the author of Citizens: Why the Key to Fixing Everything is All of Us, which was recently listed as one of the top 5 recommended books in McKinsey's 2022 Summer Reading Guide. I will be adding that to my Audible. He began his career in advertising, winning the prestigious Big Creative Idea of the Year award before making a dramatic change. Driven by a deep need to understand the impact on society of 3,000 adverts a day, he obtained 3 master's degrees exploring consumerism and its alternatives from every angle. In 2014, he co-founded the New Citizenship Project, an experimental consultancy working with organizations to invite people into their agency as citizens and not just serve them as consumers. Tendai Chetse is a corporate strategist at the BBC. He holds an MBA in strategy and entrepreneurship and has worked in media for local government, social enterprises, and several charities. At the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, he helped develop their Futures and Horizons Scanning department. He also served on their shadow executive board. He was the youngest trustee on the board of Odil's Learning Foundation, a charity which operates an English language and teacher training school, helping refugees, asylum seekers, and minority groups. He's currently building an urban design startup which works with local communities to solve social and environmental challenges across sub-Saharan Africa. Jon and Tendai, welcome.
Thank you for having us. Good to be here.
Thank you, Patrick. And you've sort of stolen our thunder because we've rehearsed very carefully our opening. And now we're sort of figuring out what to do. But one, it's been really great to have you and to meet up again. Disclaimer for everyone watching, Jon is actually my former boss. Not many people get the opportunity to interview their former boss, so I hope you're ready. This will be fun. So I guess Patrick's done a big intro, and I thought maybe something good to do would be to give the more personal side of the headlines of your journey, sort of from, I suppose, from ad world to this book, Citizens, which everyone can pick up. Maybe let's start from there.
Yeah, lovely question. Yeah, I mean, I really fell into the advertising industry, kind of having only ever really dreamed of being a professional athlete until then, and very quickly started to ask myself deeper and deeper questions about what the role of that industry was in the world. And I went through a phase of kind of trying to sell greener stuff, which still feels like it can be quite a central kind of narrative on what design for sustainability, design for planet might mean. And actually kind of went through that and maybe out the other side, and started to ask myself another question, which Patrick has referred to. Like, I came across research that said that, and this was back in 2003 actually, that estimated that the average person was exposed to something like 3,000 commercial messages a day. And started to notice that the entire narrative of who we are in society is that we're consumers, whether that's in democracy or in relation to business or in relation to movements, even to civil society and to charities. All the time we're in this position of the consumer. And I started to ask myself, what are we doing to ourselves when that's the story of our role in society? And actually went through a pretty dark and horrible personal period of like, oh my God, like I feel like I'm in this world that I kind of went into to some degree idealistically, like this is the values of the world I believe in, and then started to go, oh God, like actually I feel like I'm preaching a story that I really don't believe in. And that actually I feel is limiting of humanity. And I came out the other side of that with this question of what would it look like to use that creativity to involve people as citizens instead of just selling them stuff. And I think really at the heart of that and at the heart of the book is maybe what might be a kind of challenge to this industry, and these industries, because design is a big thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But that says, what is it not just to design for people, not just to figure out what the best, like try and be the designer figuring out, there's something implicit in the idea of a designer that the designer knows the right answer. And there's a humility in the idea of seeing people actually not as consumers that you're designing for, but as as necessary participants for you to design with. One of the phrases I use to sum up these ideas is all of us are smarter than any of us. And we actually, the strategy that we need to get us through this moment in time is to have everyone on the pitch. So maybe like that journey, I guess, maybe is one that I want to try and invite more people on, like of going, how do we ask deeper questions than just how do we create and sell greener stuff?
Yeah. And that's a story I'm sort of really familiar with, but I think one of the things that I really connected to is this thing around the fundamental belief about human beings.
Right.
And maybe talk a bit more about that, because I think there's a sort of implicit suggestion there that the way things work at the moment actually looks at people sort of as their sort of lower versions of ourselves, right, in a certain way. What are your thoughts on actually what we believe about what we're capable of, what our potential is, and also what that does to us when we believe a more positive story about ourselves?
So maybe it's worth just unpacking the core framework of ideas at the heart of the book and of my work. We talk about the idea, seeing the world through the lens of story and seeing the moment in time through the lens of story. And we talk about there being three kind of stories of the individual in society that are in competition in this moment in time. There's the consumer story, which is the sort of central default story. And it's not just about people consuming stuff. It's actually deeper than that. It's an idea that the right thing for people to do actually is to choose the best deal for themselves, to pursue self-interest on the basis that self-interest will add up to collective interest, that will result in the best outcomes for society as a whole. That is the right thing to do. And that has been the kind of, and that manifests not just in individuals, but in the role of business, for example. And the Milton Friedman frame, the social responsibility of business is to maximize its profits, is the kind of ultimate articulation of consumer logic. So there's that story, which is the sort of central default and the one that we're still to some degree living in, I think. What's happening in this moment, I believe, is that story is collapsing in on itself. It just isn't commensurate with solving the problems of our society, and actually more than that, it's arguably the cause of many of those problems. We have ecological crisis and a story that says that acquisition is the path to happiness. We have loneliness epidemic and mental health epidemic, and we have a story that says that we're isolated individuals. We have pervasive inequality and a story that says that society is a ladder that you climb. And so as that story collapses, there's huge uncertainty results from that. And what's happening in that time is that the subject story, as in subjects of the king, is kind of resurgent. And this is the authoritarian, the strongman leader, and the story of the subject is the right thing to do is to do as you're told. Keep your head down. Find the person you can follow and ascribe to, and then just like keep your head down and do your bit. And the great danger, I think, of this moment in time is that there's too many of the people in positions of power and influence who can only see those two. And therefore they think that the right thing to do, the best possible thing to do, is to defend the consumer story, to try and defend what we have. But it's unsustainable in every sense of the word. And what I'm trying to point to is that there's another story emerging and building in every aspect of society and across the world, which I call the citizen story, which is this strategy, as I say, of like, we need everyone on the pitch. We need to tap into the ideas, energy, and resources of everyone. And to your point about like that has to be rooted in a reappraisal of how we think about human nature. We have, in the consumer story, we've been which we've been in for at least the last 80 years. I think the foundation stone of that story is actually, if we're really honest with ourselves and we actually call it out, it's a kind of species level self-hatred thing, right? It's like humans are lazy and selfish, so the best we can do is try and channel that to good outcomes. And back to the role of designer is too often in that frame. And what I'm saying, actually, in the book, I say something along the lines of, I probably phrased it better in the book, but I say something along the lines of the foundation stone of this has to be belief in humanity. And all of the evidence, actually, all of the sort of stuff that's taken as proof that we are nasty, brutish, nasty, selfish creatures. I know there's one story you love, which I'll share, which is you can see Tendai was starting to grin. And there's a really lovely experiment from animal behavior and evolutionary behavior where two monkeys are given different rewards for doing a task. So capuchin monkeys, the first monkey passes a stone through the window and is given a piece of cucumber, and he eats the cucumber. The second monkey passes a stone through the window and is given a grape and eats the grape. Now, capuchin monkeys prefer grapes to cucumber, so they go back to the first monkey, offer him cucumber again, and he looks at the cucumber, having seen the grape, and throws it back at the researcher. And there's so he rejects unequal pay for unequal work. But there's a really fascinating thing that in a significant proportion of the experiments, the monkey given the grape starts to refuse the grape. Now, brief tangent, because I know how much you love that story. But the point of it really is to say, like, when I was still working in advertising and I was starting to develop these ideas, my former boss said to me, "You've got to give up on this, John. You're naive, and people are just nasty monkeys." And then when I found this experiment, I was like, even monkeys aren't just nasty monkeys. Like we are, and like the serious point I'll just close this answer on is like we are. I fundamentally believe, and I think if you interrogate the evidence, it stacks up. I have two beliefs about human nature, actually. The first is that we are by nature collaborative, creative, capable, caring creatures. The second, though, is that we are storytelling and story-dwelling creatures. And we need the stories we live within to understand what to create, who to collaborate with, what to care about, what we can do. And when we live in a consumer story, or when we live in a subject story, when one of those make America great again, make Russia, like you've heard them all. When one of those raises its head and people inhabit that story, we are capable of really terrible things. But the leap of faith that's required in this time, I think, has to start with believing in people and designing for, and I would say this in any context, not just the design conference, but starting with the design principle that we are unleashing human capability, not trying to design around human selfishness.
I think that's really, really powerful. And there's a couple of things that jump out at me when you talk about that. It's this sort of concept of what's seen and what's hidden. So there's this the language you use a lot in the book, and from our experiences, the fact that this is not something that is not a new concept you're presenting to the world. This is something that's already happening, but you're sort of just surfacing what's already happening. And a lot of the book that always strikes me is that this is not so much a book about a concept as it is about other people. And you're telling stories about lots of other people who are already doing this. But there's also another side of it, which is sort of what we can see about the sort of citizen mindset, as it were, happening. Then there's this really interesting language that I was hoping you could elaborate on seeing our prisons. And I guess there was a question that I wanted to ask you is, what is the prison that design is
okay.
What if design is in a prison?
What is it?
What is it?
Maybe I'll just start by showing a couple of the examples, just to bring to life the idea. As you say, and thank you for bringing this up, it's really important that what I'm making in this work is not a moral argument about what should happen. It's an empirical argument about what is at least a possibility. I'm not necessarily saying it's going to happen and we can all chill out and it'll be fine, but it's at least a possibility. And so the examples, some of the examples I talk about in the book are across sectors in the world of business. It's things like platform cooperativism, this movement that's incredibly, like there's like so many examples of these competitors to the Airbnbs and Ubers of this world that are owned by the users. So my favorite recent one that I came across is a cleaning company in New York State called Up and Go, which is owned by the cleaners. There's loads of competitors to Uber in that space. There's also still in business this phenomenon of equity crowdfunding, that is meaning that shareholders in an organization aren't just faceless consumers of the shares of that organization, but actually buying into the organization quite deliberately and purposefully. There's in charity world, there's all sorts of examples of the kind of the return to the reclamation of the idea of movements and the idea of charitable or causal organizations like coming in behind people rather than providing services for sort of helpless beneficiaries, which I think is a really important shift. And then in government, which is perhaps my area of most excitement at the moment, this phenomenon of participatory democracy, the rise of citizens' assemblies, randomly selected groups of people like actually making meaningful decisions. My favorite example is the city of Paris now has a standing citizens' assembly as part of its governance structure. And these things are all examples. What I'm trying to do with the book is say these are all examples of one phenomenon. This is all people being involved and being offered meaningful agency in shaping the world that they're part of and taking responsibility as a result. My favorite example, just very quickly, my favorite example is the transformation of the Taiwanese government over the last 10 years, and you'll have to read the book for the full one, my friends.
Yes, and we have very often sort of fanboyed over Audrey Tang and everything that's going on in Taiwan.
So just a taster for the people watching this, their COVID response is just fascinating. They talked about it being characterized by the principles fast, fun, and fair, and they set challenge prizes for people to create apps that would track face mask of everything. Their whole frame was, we don't know how to get through this, but we know we'll get through it better if we tap into the ideas and energy and resources of everyone. Even set up a phone line where anyone could ring in with ideas for how the country's response could be better. And it's just that kind of spirit and permission is so powerful. And I think, so to come back to your question of like, what is the prism? I think that I use that metaphor in the book as a way of articulating what these stories become when we become unaware, when we lose awareness of them. And there's the other metaphor that sometimes used is like, it's like the water we swim in. You know, it's like the fish swimming around and like you don't know it's water, like fish don't have a name for water kind of thing. It's like, and it's that sort of phenomenon. I think for all of us, really, I think it's really easy to be stuck in the prison of the consumer story because it's the systems thinker Donella Meadows has this lovely language. She talks about these stories, these paradigms as the unspoken assumptions of society, unspoken because they don't need to be spoken, because everyone shares them. And I think like this moment that we're living in, like we're gathering in Design for Planet, gathering virtually, because the inequality of the world is driving us to the point of ubiquitous strikes. We're gathering in a moment when 33 million people are displaced and we're in it now. And yet too many of the solutions we're still trying to design we're designing from within the consumer story, because those are the only mental models and patterns that we have. And so we're still looking at I would argue is a deeply flawed process that in Egypt that at best represents consumer democracy, a democracy where people choose between options every few. When there's so much, when we need to be sort of coming deeper and coming at this from a place of, okay, how do we redesign every aspect really of our society from a perspective that says what we need to do is put more meaningful power into more people's hands more of the time.
And just going to pause there for a second to say, we are obviously, I should have mentioned this earlier. If you have questions, please drop them into the Q&A. We want to hear from them a bit later in the spirit of relying on the brains of all of us. So do send in your questions, and we'll hopefully chat through them in a few minutes. But I wanted to touch on a couple of other things really quickly. I think the question around we need to redesign everything. That's quite a big charge, right? And then and one of the things that comes to mind for me is also is a question of, do we need to redesign design itself, right? I often ask people, in design circles, do you see yourself as a designer? Do you see yourself as a designer? And I sort of waltz in there, and I call myself a small d designer, because I don't sort of necessarily come from a formal background that some people who are in built environment or architecture or graphic design or fashion come from. I have tended to design organizations and teams, and it's sort of not necessarily in the mold of what is formally recognized. And I guess part of what I think of in terms of relying on everyone is how do we unleash the designer in everyone, rather than saying how do we sort of start with the people who already know they are designers. I'm excited by the thing of going, oh, someone discovering that they are when they didn't really see themselves as not. And I want to ask you a bit of that, of citizens, the concept citizens. I think worth clarifying for everyone. You're not talking about a sort of a passport,
right?
Like a formal citizenship to a state or a region or a geography. You're talking about a mindset, but B, something that is within people. It's not sort of an accredited thing,
right?
So how does sort of when we're thinking about climate, etc., how do we unleash that in everyone?
So I think that's a lovely question. And it's really important to emphasize. So in the book, I make the distinction between what I call citizenship as practice and citizenship as status. And I would actually argue that the citizenship as status, which is the passport you hold and so on, is really represents the consumerization of the very concept of citizenship. And one of the joyful discoveries, like designers will appreciate this, that one of the joyful discoveries in the research for the book was the etymology of the word citizen. What we tend to assume is that the word citizen probably comes from city, because it's a longer word, so it probably comes underneath, and therefore it's geographically defined in our minds, right? You're a citizen of somewhere by definition. Actually, the etymology is the other way around. The word citizen comes first. It literally means together people. And a city is simply a place where people are together. And I really love that inversion. And I think on this, the other thing I would say on this is I think it's I've had several people, and I do hear this, and I acknowledge I always want to make clear that I do acknowledge my kind of privilege in this space. And you and I have had conversations where you've made me repeatedly aware of some of this stuff, and I thank you for your friendship in that. But the danger, the thing I always insist on really is the danger of letting go of that language, the danger of not using, the danger of abrogating the word citizen to those who would make it mean only a status. Words are so powerful. And if we give up that language, then we're giving up something incredibly important. I think, and just to say, by the way, I'm working with a whole group of people, and in parallel with and in collaboration with a whole group of people who are sharing that belief. So Baratunde Thurston in the States, there's a wonderful podcast called How to Citizen, where he uses the word citizen as a verb that I would really encourage people to check out. Eric Liu, again in the States, runs a thing called Citizen University. There's some really, I think there is a kind of a growing feeling that we do have to fight for this language. The other thing I want to do is just come back to your little D designer. I mean, man, I remember when one of my sort of instinctive sickenings working in the advertising industry back in the day was the fact that there were people whose job title was creative, and they had a capital C on creative. You're like, what about the rest of us, man? Like, is creativity only the people on the seventh floor, right? And I think that I'm also a huge fan of a lovely organization, wonderful organization called 64 Million Artists. And Joe Hunter, the founder of 64 Million, insists on the small a, like everyone's an artist. The reason for the name of the organization is 64 million people in the country at the time are artists. And I think that I think there's a humility in that from those who have the capital letter at the moment as well. And I think that humility requires, I think the one thing I would do if I could like have one intervention would be to have like facilitation training as a universal thing. Particularly for people in the creative industries and in politics, actually. I think if everyone in those two industries had real facilitation skills and that mindset of bringing the best out of those in the room rather than doing for, I think it is it can feel an overwhelming thing to say we need to redesign everything. but that sort of means we need everyone to be a designer as well, and that sort of makes it a huge creative opportunity. But that I think has to start with, and can like unleash so much if we can step into that mindset of everyone a designer.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a bunch of questions coming in. Thank you for the questions. I want to ask one more, if I may, indulge myself, and then we'll get to everyone else's. Sorry, guys. I'm privileged of being in this seat. I will use it now and quickly move on. The thing around, I think one of the things I love about what you said is the sort of redesigning everything requires everyone. And co-design is a word that we use a lot. And then when we were working together, the phrase we used to use was co-creation. And there's a subtlety and difference in that sometimes. But I guess one of the things, bringing it back to sort of the planetary and environmental crisis that we're in, is that anyone who's ever done co-design or co-creation knows it takes time. It can be slow work, right? Because it's relational, it's human. It's about trying to build up that sense of a sort of an organic sense of human connection, and taking people with you. So what are your thoughts on how that juxtaposes with the need for speed, in the sense that we need answers now, we need solutions now, but co-creation and co-design takes time? What are your thoughts on that?
You're tough, man. This is supposed to be a chat with a friend. No, I think so. I sometimes characterize this as the urgency versus agency challenge. There's a couple of things I would say. The first is, what do we mean by urgent? And what are we actually trying to do here? And I think if we're trying to build a society in which everyone leads meaningful lives, then there's not a shortcut to that in many ways. If the urgency versus agency argument can be used in service of a kind of a sort of, what's the word, beneficent dictator or whatever, and you're like, but we're seeing in this moment in time that there is no such thing. Whether that's the billionaires or the authoritarian elite or the authoritarian governments, we're seeing the sort of true. There isn't such a thing. So there is no, you can't allow urgency to become a narrative that drives us out of agency. The second thing I would say is I would actually contest the premise a little bit. I think it takes longer in the immediate term, but what's then unleashed moves fast. And maybe I'll refer back to the Taiwan example in this context. The transformation of the government of Taiwan really only began with a small-scale group of hackers coming together to start building parallel websites to government websites as an arts project in 2012. By 2016, they had a minister in the government. And by 2020, that minister, Audrey Tang, who we talked about, who you mentioned, was leading the nation's COVID response. And so I think that work of imagination, of building, it can feel like you're not going straight to action, but going straight to action is if it doesn't involve people and build agency, we'll only get unpicked anyway. We'll only polarize and alienate and end in crisis. I'm so excited. One of the things I'm most excited about at the moment, we're working on a campaign called the People's Plan for Nature, which is basically in the UK a campaign which is seeing the big nature conservation organisations, the RSPB, the WWF, the National Trust, work together collaboratively to hold the space for the ideas and stories and examples of all the people who are already working for nature in their local communities to come forward, and then bring all of the expertise of that, but also the sort of the experts in those organisations and economists and so forth into a citizens' assembly process, which will then produce recommendations for what national government can do, but also what local communities can do, and provide a kind of convening point that is intended to kind of unleash a huge amount of energy. Now, those organisations have had policy asks and so on for years, but this is all, and they could just keep doing what they've always done, but they'll get what they've always got, as the saying goes. And so this campaign is so exciting as a way of them actually building with people. And I don't know if it's going to work. But what I do know is that the energy that's coming forth into that space is tremendous. And I think that it's inspired by the GovZero thing, because it's really about saying, let's not abrogate all of our agency to government. Let's not define all of our agency by our relationship to the existing institutions, whether government or otherwise. The work, at least some of the work in this moment in time, I love design audience. I love the Buckminster Fuller thing about how you make change. He said you never create change by fighting the existing reality. To change something, create a new reality that makes the existing obsolete. And I think that's what the People's Plan is an attempt at doing. And I think that's a lot of the work that we need to do in this time, not just lobby government or campaign against organizations, not be defined in relation to those things, but build.
That is really fun. And I am resisting the urge to ask a follow-up because I would like to get to some questions. So let's see here. Who have we got? Let's pick out. So there's a couple here which are of a theme, which is around citizens and democracy. So there's one about how can we use the concept of citizens to enact democratic change when political and media elites are actively limiting who is recognized as a citizen. And there is this concept around sort of, again, I think something that you touched on earlier, which is around status and passport. Any responses to that?
Yeah, I mean, just to build on what I was saying before, I think, like, I'm not saying that this is a sort of really simple thing, and I think the example of the People's Plan for Nature is one that I would put into this space as well. It's like the work I think of enacting democratic change is actually, I mean, okay, let's put this in a design context. One of the great things for designers to do is to challenge the assumptions in a given space, right? And I think like the great assumption in the space of democracy is that democracy equals elections. And actually, like, that's not necessarily the case.
Yes,
like
absolutely.
the really interesting, like, I would argue that what we live in today is a consumer democracy, where our agency is limited to choosing between the options someone else offers, and where we're encouraged to make that choice on the basis of self-interest. What might a citizen democracy look like? How do we use citizens' assemblies and open idea generation and story sharing and matched crowdfunding and like all of these participatory dynamics actually and shared ownership and these sorts of things to really build a world where people have meaningful power to shape their societies, which is the literal meaning of democracy.
Yes, exactly.
And I think that sort of spirit, that's how we really make democratic change. We build it and make it impossible to ignore. I just like on this the status, and I always like to remind people of where the UK was in April, May 2020. Because like, so just to remind you, street WhatsApp groups, in the context of the first wave of the pandemic, street WhatsApp groups, mutual aid groups, the NHS First Responder Scheme was set up for 250,000 people to apply in 3 weeks. 750,000 applied in 36 hours. This is a UK analogy, but this is true in all over the world. In 3 months, the percentage of people who believe that Britain's a country where people look out for each other went from 18% in February to 63% in May. I think the numbers are, and that was an emergence of a story. And we were building democratic change. The challenge is, how do you get that story to really take hold? And how do we build in such a way that the next time the cracks open, then that story is unignorable.
Absolutely.
I really love that the Leonard Cohen thing. I always quote it like, there's a crack in everything, that's where the light gets in. And there are going to be more cracks, right? Like, we all know it. And acknowledging that, being honest about that, and then preparing for it. The system, like design thinking systems guru Nora Bateson has this lovely phrase she's starting to talk about readiness. And I think that's a big part of this idea of how do we prepare for democratic change.
Yeah, that's amazing. We've got a couple more, so let's touch on any that could take your fancy here, John. There's one here around. There's a couple around tech.
Yeah.
So there's one around how do we ensure active participation in design of our world, looking ahead to rising automation via AI, and then another on Mr. Elon Musk and Twitter.
Someone's gone Musk.
Someone's gone Musk. I thought it might be avoidable. It's not avoidable. So, do you want to take those two together? So, any thoughts on those two?
Yeah. Look, maybe what I'll say. Sometimes people say to me, like, technology's going this way, right? Like, there's Web3, ownership shared, and I think what we're seeing with some of how Web3 is being enacted and some of how Elon Musk is behaving is why the sort of technology will save us thing isn't going to happen.
Yeah.
And the way I think about this is to go back actually to an analogous moment. Which is the sort of advent of the sharing, what was then called the sharing economy, if you remember those halcyon
absolutely,
days. But the idea of those new initiatives was that they were gonna solve all this for us. We were going to share everything, and our material resource use was going to go through the floor, and we're going to have more equal societies, and we weren't going to need throughput, and we were going to have better societies and lower environmental impact as a result. And the central reason why that was hypothesized to be going to happen was that all of the things we previously transacted for would become human relationships. And actually what happened is the reverse, right? Even like where we had previously had human relationship, they become transactions. Like we became consumers of each other through these platforms. And I think that what that speaks to is the essential role of story and the mindset from within which we design. Because if we design from within a consumer mindset and adopting consumer assumptions, then whatever technology we use, we will probably not even just continue, but actually accentuate and accelerate that story. Rocket boost it. Whereas if we design from within the citizen story, those potentials are also present in these technologies and in everything we do. And being conscious about those, I think, and then designing from them, designing for involvement, designing with process and mindset are key.
Yeah. I think one of the things that really strikes me about that is when I was in DCMS, there was a lot of thinking around thought around Shoshana Zuboff, who writes a lot about the sort of myth of inevitability around tech. It's this, and how sort of the Silicon Valley narrative is that every sort of push in towards a sort of highly digitized future that is Silicon Valley made is a sort of inevitable wave that we're just going in that direction. There's nothing we can do about it. And I love the framing that you presented of actually the role of designers in rethinking assumptions is actually challenging assumptions. And actually some of those assumptions don't necessarily have to be the case. And some of those inevitabilities that we think are actually might not be. And that's a very hopeful story.
And maybe I'll end, my last contribution then would be where I ended the book actually, which is citing Rebecca Solnit and her definition of hope. And I love it because Solnit says optimism is the belief that things will be great no matter what we do. Pessimism is the belief that things will be rubbish no matter what we do. Both excuse us from action. And which says hope exists in the spaciousness of uncertainty, and it's clarity and imagination, seeing the troubles of the world and imagining how they could be different. And so I think what that creates is the space for agency and the space for belief in humanity. And my last thing and the question that I end the book on as an offer to the readership and to those listening to this is like asking myself, this is my practice every day, what would I do today if I truly believed in those around me and in myself?
So I think that's a very, very good question to land on. What would you do if you believed in everyone around you? Sorry, we couldn't cover all the questions in this. There's so many more. I'm not sure if there is functionality for us to get those questions, and maybe we can get back to some of them. But thank you so much for joining us in our sort of little corner of London here. It's been great to have you, Jon. Good to see you again.
Thank you, my friend.
And yeah, back to you, Patrick.